In this video, we're going to talk about the cell membrane, and we're going to identify the components that make up that membrane. Now, the first thing we're going to do is talk about something known as the fluid mosaic model. So this model describes the cell membrane. It tells us that the membrane is fluid, which means that the phospholipids are free to move in any direction in this membrane. Even the proteins highlighted in purple, they're also fluid. They can move about in this membrane as well. The word mosaic tells us that this picture is composed of many different parts. The membrane is composed of phospholipids, proteins, glycoproteins, glycolipids, cholesterol, and things like that. So there's many different parts that make up the cell membrane. But the first component we're going to talk about is the phospholipid in red. The membrane is mostly composed of phospholipids. The phospholipid has a polar head and two nonpolar tails. So keep in mind the phospholipid is composed of a phosphate group. It has two fatty acid chains, and it also has a glycerol molecule. The two fatty acid tails are nonpolar, which means that they're hydrophobic. They don't like water. The polar head is hydrophilic. It loves water. Water exists in the extracellular fluid outside of the cell, and it also is present in the intracellular space that is inside of the cell. So all of the phospholipids, the polar heads are faced toward water. The nonpolar tails are faced away from water in the interior of the cell membrane. Now, here's a question for you. What word describes the dual polarity nature of a phospholipid? We said that a phospholipid has a polar hydrophilic head and two nonpolar hydrophilic tails. There's a word that describes a molecule with hydrophobic and hydrophilic parts. What word is that? That word is amphipathic. Phospholipids are amphipathic because they're both hydrophobic and hydrophilic. So they make up the phospholipid bilayer of the cell membrane. So that's the first component of the cell membrane that you need to be familiar with. Now the cell membrane consists of a lot of proteins. And there's different types of proteins. They're highlighted in purple. What do you call this protein right here? So if you see a circular protein, it's known as a globular protein. And the fact that it's on the exterior, it's also called a peripheral protein. This protein here is known as a surface protein because it's on the surface of the phospholipid bilayer. Now, how would you distinguish these two proteins? What would you say? By the way, this is another peripheral protein, but it's not a globular protein. Now, how would you distinguish between an integral protein and a transmembrane protein? This protein here is known as a transmembrane protein. I'm just going to put TMP for that since I'm running out of space. A transmembrane protein spans across the membrane. So as you can see, part of it is outside of the membrane and the rest of it is inside of the membrane. This here is called an integral protein. An integral protein is embedded within the membrane. Now, a transmembrane protein is also an integral protein because for them to span the entire membrane, they also have to be within the membrane as well. So all transmembrane proteins are integral proteins, but not all integral proteins are transmembrane proteins. So as we said before, this is both a transmembrane protein and an integral protein. But this right here is an integral protein and not a transmembrane protein. Now I had to clear away a few things because the page was getting crowded. Now, one thing I do want to mention is you could also have a surface protein on the inside of a cell, but it's on the surface of the membrane. And some of these surface proteins, they could be anchored to the cytoskeleton network of the cell through filaments. Now, some of the surface proteins and also the peripheral proteins, they could function as enzymes. So they can speed up chemical reactions within the cell as well. Now, here's another question for you. What's the difference between these two structures there? What are they called? So here we have a protein attached to a sugar chain. Those hexagonal shapes represents the 6-carbon glucose unit. So we have a carbohydrate attached to a protein. So this is called a glycoprotein. Many glycoproteins, which are found on the surface of cellular membranes, they play a role in the immune system with antibodies. They function as a self-recognition and cell-to-cell interactions. Now, over here, notice that we have a sugar unit attached to a phospholipid. So in this case, this would be a glycolipid, which also plays a role in cell-to-cell interactions and cell signaling. Now, the next thing we're going to talk about is how things flow into and out of the membrane. The cell membrane is semipermeable, which means it allows certain things to get in while blocking other things or preventing other things from entering the cell. Now, small nonpolar molecules can easily diffuse into or out of the cell. So when you take a breath, when you breathe in, you're breathing in O2. Oxygen flows into the cell because the cell needs it. And then when you exhale, you breathe out carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide tends to flow out of the cell. So both of these molecules are nonpolar small molecules. They can easily pass in and out of the cellular membrane. Now, water is a small polar molecule. And it turns out that water can diffuse through the membrane, but it can't do it easily. It's a very slow process because water is polar and it doesn't mix well with the nonpolar interior region. However, because the concentration of water is so high inside and outside of the cell, some of it will force its way through the cellular membrane. But now there are special proteins that can easily transport water into and out of the cell. And these are called aquaporins. So this protein right here, this integral protein, also serves as a protein that transports stuff. A protein that transports water through the membrane, as you said before, are aquaporins. Water can flow into or out of, that protein. So if you drink a glass of water, water is going to flow into your cells. If it's a hot day and you're jogging and you're sweating, you're dehydrated, water is flowing out of your cells. So water can go in either direction. Now, what about other particles? Let's say like an ion, potassium and sodium. Can they flow into and out of the cellular membrane? Now, ions, they can't flow in and out of the cellular membrane without the help of a transport protein. So they can't just pass through the membrane. Their charges are significantly greater than water. Water is neutral, but it has partial charges, which makes it polar. Ions have a complete, full, positive or negative charge. So they just can't flow through the membrane without the help of a transport protein. So the protein that they need is called a channel protein. Specifically, it's known as ion channels. So the ion channels will help sodium and potassium to flow either into or out of the cell. One example is the sodium-potassium pump, which I'm not going to go into detail into this video. So integral proteins, they could serve as channel proteins, they could serve as carrier proteins, and things like that. Now this right here is an example of a carrier protein. Let's say if you have a big molecule like glucose. The carrier protein can take in glucose, and then this part can close, and this part will open, and then glucose will travel through. Glucose is a big polar molecule. It can't simply diffuse through the membrane, so it needs the help of a carrier protein to get it across the membrane. So just to review, small molecules like oxygen, carbon dioxide, water, they can diffuse through the membrane. For water, it's a little bit difficult. Big molecules like glucose, big polar molecules, they can't diffuse through the cell. And ions like sodium, potassium, they can't diffuse across the membrane without the help of a protein. Now, there's one more thing that we need to talk about regarding the cell membrane, another important component, and that is cholesterol, which is right here. Now, cholesterol has a polar region and a nonpolar region. The circle in blue is the hydroxyl group of the cholesterol molecule. And the hydroxyl group is polar because of hydrogen bonding. It's very attracted to water. And so it's going to be facing outside of the cellular membrane. Now the four fused rings of cholesterol, that's the nonpolar region, the hydrophobic region. And so that's going to be pointing towards the interior of the membrane. Now the function of cholesterol in the membrane is very important. Cholesterol acts as a buffer. It maintains the fluidity of the membrane. Here's a question for you. If you increase the temperature, what happens to the membrane? Will it become more fluid or less fluid? Will the phospholipids, will they move apart from each other, or will they move closer to each other? Now let's think of water. At room temperature, water is fluid. If you decrease the temperature, let's say if you put it in a freezer, it's going to turn to ice. It's not going to be fluid anymore. So whenever you increase the temperature, you increase the fluidity of a material. Now, as you increase the temperature of the cellular membrane, the phospholipids will move apart from each other, and so they will become more fluid. Cholesterol, it functions to maintain the fluidity. So it's going to try to decrease the fluidity. And so what it does is it kind of prevents the phospholipids from moving apart from each other so that the cell membrane just doesn't dissolve. Now, if we decrease the temperature, the fluidity of the membrane will decrease. It will become more rigid. Cholesterol will act to prevent that. It's going to try to increase the fluidity. So it acts as a spacer. So these phospholipids, when the temperature goes down, they want to get closer. And so what happens is cholesterol prevents them from getting too close. So whenever the fluidity goes up, cholesterol tries to bring it down. When the fluidity goes down, cholesterol tries to bring it up. So it maintains the fluidity of the cell. So it's another example of homeostasis or equilibrium. So that's the function of cholesterol in the cell membrane. Now let's work on some practice problems, just to review some of the things that we covered earlier in this video. Number 1, which of the following statements is not true concerning phospholipids? Would you say A, phospholipids are amphipathic, B, phospholipids contain a hydrophilic head, C, the tails of a phospholipid point toward the interior of the cellular membrane, D, phospholipids are the major components of the cell membrane bilayer, or E, phospholipids contain a phosphate group, 3 fatty acid tails, and a glycerol molecule. So which of these statements is not true, or which one is false? So let's go through each one. This is a true statement. Phospholipids are amphipathic. They contain a hydrophilic polar head. and the tails are hydrophobic. So answer choice A is the true statement. B, phospholipids contain a hydrophilic head. That is also true, as you can see that here. And for C, the tails of a phospholipid point toward the interior of the cellular membrane. That is also true. The membrane looks like this, and as you can see, the tails are definitely in the interior of the membrane. Now, for answer choice D, phospholipids are the major components of the cell membrane bilayer. That is definitely a true statement. The only thing that's false is E. Phospholipids do contain a phosphate group, and they contain a glycerol molecule, but they don't have 3 fatty acid tails. They only have 2. And so that's why E is not true. Number 2. Which of the following particles cannot pass through the cell membrane without the assistance of a transport protein? So we're going to circle each one because there can be multiple answers. So let's say this is the cell membrane. Can water pass through the cell membrane? What would you say? Now, it's not that easy, but because there's a lot of water inside and outside of the cell, the human body is mostly composed of water, it can fit through it. It's very small. So water can pass through the cell membrane. So this is not what we're looking for. Now, what about the potassium ion? Can that pass through it? Ions are not able to go through the membrane. They can't get to this hydrophobic region. So B is one of the answers that we're looking for. Nonpolar molecules like O2, this can easily diffuse in the cell membrane. And carbon dioxide, which is another nonpolar molecule, that can easily diffuse out of the membrane, out of the cell, into the extracellular fluid. So we can eliminate answer choice C and D. Now glucose can't diffuse through the membrane without the assistance of a transport protein. So glucose, it needs a carrier protein to get through the membrane. So E would also be an answer. So it's both B and E. Ions and big polar molecules like glucose, they need a transport protein to pass through the membrane. Number 3. Which of the following proteins span across the entire cell membrane? Is it A, surface proteins, B, the globular proteins, C, transmembrane proteins, D, integral proteins, or E, carrier proteins? What would you say? So let's say this is the cell membrane. So this would be a surface protein. This would be a globular protein. And it's also a peripheral protein because it sticks out of the membrane but doesn't pass through it. This would be an integral protein. And this would be a transmembrane protein. The best answer is the transmembrane protein. It spans across the entire cell membrane. The integral protein, it's simply embedded within the cell membrane. Now keep in mind, all transmembrane proteins are integral proteins, but not all integral proteins are transmembrane proteins. And carrier proteins, as we mentioned in the video, they simply carry stuff across the cell membrane. So this is really not the best description of a transmembrane protein. They could be transmembrane proteins, they could be integral proteins, but this answer is the best answer. Number 4. Which of the following molecules act as a fluidity buffer in the cellular membrane? Is it cholesterol, aquaporins, ion channels, glycoproteins, or glycolipids? It's not going to be aquaporins. Keep in mind, these are proteins that can carry water across the membrane. It's not going to be ion channels. Ion channels are protein channels that carry ions like potassium and sodium across the cell membrane. And it's not going to be glycoproteins. So these exist on the surface of the cell, and it's not going to be glycolipids. The answer is cholesterol. So keep in mind, as the temperature goes up, the fluidity of the membrane goes up, the phospholipids move apart, but cholesterol kind of anchors the phospholipids together, so it prevents them from moving apart, thus maintaining the fluidity. So whenever the temperature goes up, cholesterol tries to decrease the fluidity of the membrane. Under colder conditions, the membrane becomes more rigid. Cholesterol acts as a spacer, increasing the fluidity of the membrane. So cholesterol maintains the fluidity of the membrane. Now here's another question for you. Number 5. Which of the following can increase the fluidity of the cellular membrane? So number 1, we've already covered this. We know that increasing the temperature will increase the fluidity of the membrane. So number 1 is a true statement. But what about number 2? Increasing the number of saturated phospholipids. Will that increase or decrease the fluidity of the cellular membrane? Well, let's talk about saturated fatty acids. A saturated fatty acid, if you recall, has no double bonds. And these tend to be solid at room temperature. Now, an unsaturated fatty acid, they do carry double bonds, and this creates a kink in the structure. So these type of fatty acids tend to be liquid or oils at room temperature. So you need to understand that saturated fatty acids and saturated phospholipids, they tend to be more rigid, whereas the unsaturated phospholipids will have more fluidity. They're going to be more liquid. So the correct answer will be increasing the number of unsaturated phospholipids. That's going to increase the fluidity. If you increase the number of saturated phospholipids, that will decrease the fluidity. So number 2 is false. The answer is going to be 1 and 3, which is answer choice B. So this will be an example of a saturated phospholipid because both of the fatty acids, they're straight. This is an example of an unsaturated phospholipid. As you can see, one of the fatty acid chains has a kink in the structure, which means it has a double bond. So if you have more of these phospholipids, the membrane is going to be more fluid. Phospholipids of this nature will create a membrane that's more rigid and less fluid. Now let's work on some matching problems. Feel free to pause the video and work out these questions for the sake of a review. So let's go ahead and begin. Number 1. So this allows some molecules to pass through while preventing others from doing so. So which word best describes that sentence? So the answer for this would be a semipermeable membrane. It allows certain molecules to pass through the membrane while preventing others from doing so. Number 2. So which word goes with this sentence? It allows water to pass through the membrane efficiently. So this would be an aquaporin. Number 3. This explains how phospholipids and proteins are free to move in the cell membrane. So this is going to be the fluid Mosaic model. So we're going to put letter I for number 3. Number 4. This allows particles like potassium and sodium ions to pass through the membrane. So this is going to be ion channels. So let's put G for number 4. Number 5, this maintains the fluidity of the cell membrane. So this is going to be cholesterol. So let's put B for 5. Number 6, this molecule plays a role in cell communication and self-recognition in the immune system. What molecule is that? This is going to be the glycoproteins. So that's a D. Number 7, an amphipathic molecule that makes up the cell membrane bilayer. Which one is that? So the answer is going to be L. Phospholipids are amphipathic. They contain hydrophobic and hydrophilic parts to themselves, and they make up the phospholipid bilayer of the cell membrane. Number 8. So this plays a role in cell signaling, I said that wrong, cell signaling and tissue recognition. So this is going to be the glycolipids. And number 9, this macromolecule is completely embedded within the lipid bilayer. My words is just not coming out right today. So this is going to be the integral proteins. They're completely integrated in the lipid bilayer. Number 10, this molecule completely spans through the membrane. So this is going to be the transmembrane protein. So that's C. Number 11, this component transports molecules across the membrane. So that's going to be the carrier protein. That's H. And 12, this molecule lies on the exterior of the cell membrane, which is F, the peripheral proteins. Surface proteins also lie on the exterior of the cell membrane. But the peripheral proteins, part of it is inside the membrane and part of it is outside of the membrane. But it doesn't span completely through the membrane. So that's basically it for this video. That's an introduction into the cell membrane. Thanks again for watching, and if you like it, don't forget to subscribe to this channel.